My name is AWIT Marcelino. I'm a Master of Divinity student. I was an intern at the Multi-Faith Center, and I chose to spend a lot of my time with the Korean religion program. I came in as an intern and I helped out with some programming, but in Korean religion, I felt like I was more of a participant. I guess exploring spirituality, but also sexuality and identity were important because those are things that I had never discussed. Those are things that I had never even seen as options when I was growing up in the church. I'm a second generation Filipino Canadian, and I grew up in a Filipino Christian church. And I think there's a lot of Asian repression when you're thinking about relationships, sexuality, and like gender identity. People don't talk about dating or relationships. They actually kind of dissuade you from doing that as a young person. So as a youth leader, I wasn't empowered or allowed to talk about those things with younger people. The unspoken rule was abstinence and don't date. So you don't explore any of those things or any of those conversations. So I felt like now as I'm learning to, how to become a minister, how to become a pastor, I wanted to include that. I wanted it to be something that could be talked about easily and comfortably without shame. And so learning about it and becoming a participant in the Korean religion program as a heterosexual person, but still as someone who hasn't really explored any of that, was important for me at that time because I was 30, turning 31, and I hadn't talked about sex and faith. So I felt kind of like a freaking teenager. I felt like a young person, and probably this is the same kind of mentality as some of the young people in my youth group felt. Because I could talk about it with my friends who weren't religious, but I'd never brought the two together where other people of faith are talking about sexuality openly and without shame. One of the most significant events or experiences that I've had with Korean religion was the first event that I attended, which was a curated storytelling circle. And it happened during orientation week at the beginning of the year. And there were about 5 or 6 people who had been asked ahead of time to bring in an item or object that represented a memory or their faith journey or their sexuality or gender identity in some way, or all of those things, and to speak about it in front of strangers. I remember I was running late. So I was a bit frantic and stressed out a little bit because I actually hate being late. And so when I went in, there were actually just a few spots that hadn't been taken because it was very well attended. And so there was, I think, a lot of maybe some anxiety for sure about being late, being new, and maybe even not identifying as queer, but being at this queer event. What do people think of me as an Asian, as a person of color, as a woman? Sometimes I get worried about that because I don't want people to think certain things, because I recognize that I think those things about certain people, because I also have this, I guess, a bias or prejudice against Asians who are Christian. Sometimes I find that a lot of Asian Christians on campus are more socially conservative. They can be homophobic. Sometimes I wonder, what kind of Christian are they? So there's a bit of that kind of stress. But I was happy to see that there were actually a number of people of color in the room, which is kind of, it's very different from being in other spaces on campus. Since I didn't know who was going to be sharing a story, and I think most of the storytellers brought something from a bag, and so everything was kind of packed away. So there was this feeling of, I wonder what's next. One by one, each one would take something from their bag or from behind their chair, and they would share. It was really, I don't know, kind of magical. Even though there might have been some things that resonated with me, or I felt like it related to a part of my childhood or growing up years in the church, adding that element or that layer of queer identity makes things a lot more complicated and murky and sometimes difficult. So I think it was important for that moment to be the beginning of my experience with Korean religion, because it taught me that it's not about me. And I feel honored to be in that space, but I don't need to speak. It's about giving others space. I think what I'll take with me and what I have been taking with me in these last 2 years is an openness to talking about faith, spirituality, sexuality, and gender identity compassionately and gently without judgment or shame. I think that there are so many people in faith communities who feel like these types of conversations need to be totally separate or not had at all. These are things that should be talked about. And I hope that it also translates to what we say from the pulpit, or at least what I say from the pulpit, about certain scriptures that are super violent. And sometimes there is no way to explain them, but to say that this is not how we live out our faith today. Another thing that I learned is hospitality. Mixed into all of the conversations, we had food, art, and then at the end of the year, we got to do this long drive in one car and see some really beautiful spots in Ontario. That's definitely part of my memories of QR. All of those things, the friendships that we started making, this really super inviting space with food and colorful things that we could play with as we talked about these heavier topics. All those things made me feel welcome as not a queer person, but going to queering religion. I felt welcomed. And I think that is definitely something I need to take with me in my ministry, is this kind of hospitality that is radical, that is open to conversations, but also feeds people in their faith, but also feeds people when they're hungry and they want to meet up with friends. So hospitality was huge.